the primary reassembly is now complete. Last thing to really go on, of course, will be the valve covers and the carburetors. But in terms of the valve train itself, we just about got it done. I just added the top chain tensioner right here. These have been torqued. I just loosened, I did it off camera, but I just loosened this lock nut and then loosened this bolt back off so that the tensioner would be pushed forward by the spring. And I actually did that and heard that. And then I just snugged up the bolt and snugged up the lock nut. You don't need to overdo the tightening of these. All you got to do is snug them up. The next step, though, is not to put the valve covers on. What I need to do is check the valve gap between the cam lobe, one of the cam lobes, and the bucket beneath each respective cam lobe. And that's a fairly involved process to do that. And I believe I'm very likely going to have to pull this top assembly back apart, that being the cams, to get at the shims, because if you recall, I did lap these in, and if I was a betting guy, I'm going to say I'm going to have to adjust some of the shims on the various cams. So, and I'm anticipating having to pull it back apart. So if I find a gapping problem, it's not going to knock me off my game. I'm really expecting I'm going to have to go through that before I can finish up the engine and try to get her started. But before I move on to checking the valve gap, the shim gap, I'm going to check one more time. It might sound like I'm being overly cautious, but one does need to make sure that they got the valve timing exact. And I'm a deliberate person, and you don't want to get your valve timing out of sync, or you could bend the valve and then you have a whole lot of work you've got to go back through and redo. So to double check the valve cam timing in the chain, it's pretty simple. I'm going to put a 17mm wrench on the large bolt on the end of the crank. I'm going to turn it 2 complete revolutions, 360 degrees twice, to bring it back to the same spot it's at right now, which is the white arrow here with the T pointing forward, the white arrow at the rear with the T pointing rearward. I will count starting here again. I know this is redundant, but I just want to make sure everybody understands. Starting with 0 at the arrow, count all the way around, and I should end up at 36. Now, I'm not going to show that on camera because I've been through this before with folks, but that's the next step, that I'm going to do that rotation. Then I'm going to come back and start checking the gap on each of the valve and cam lobes to see if I've got to go back in and reshim, and again, I'm expecting I will. I'm not going to show the actual checking of the valve clearance in this series. There's at least one, if not several, very good YouTube videos already out there on how to do that on this very motor. So I thought rather than duplicating effort, you can just go out on YouTube and do a little search, and I think you'll find what you're looking for. It's not complicated. I'll briefly describe my process, and if there's really interest, I can go into more detail another time, but I basically want to use 4 feeler gauges. A 0.10 millimeter, that'd be this one, is my primary one. That's really my target thickness. By the way, that's 4/1000 of an inch, if you're curious about that. And then these other 3 I use is essentially go no-goes. So this one becomes my target, like you can see here. Since that cleared, that's my minimum clearance I really would prefer. Then I'll keep working up to the next one. If that one just doesn't quite want to go in, I know I'm well within range. These 2, this is the minimum, and this would be the maximum. So certainly that would be a definite no-go, which is accurate. And this one should always go, which it does. So that's the process I use to check my valve clearance. So that's already done. I did have to swap some shims around, and actually I had to buy a couple of new shims because I didn't have the right sizes. At this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to install the valve cover, and then we're getting real close to finishing up the motor. I'll remount the coils. I got those out of the way so that I could work in here. and get the coils back in, spark plugs back in, and then the carburetors back on. So we're not that far away. Getting the carburetors back on is probably going to be the biggest, most involved step I've got remaining. But for all practical purposes, the top of the engine is back together. Before I go ahead and put the valve cover on, there's a couple of other things I need to take care of first. First item on the list is to get the tack cable reinstalled here. There is a gear on the end of this cable that fits into the head like this. And that gear is driven by this gear that's machined right here, you can see in the cam itself. So as the cam turns, this meshes with the gear that's, I've already installed it in here, which then in fact will drive the tack cable, which will spin. Very simple to put in. There's an O-ring in there so that the oil flowing through the head doesn't leak out. You lubricate that vinyl or rubber O-ring. It's basically a seal well. I put a little assembly lube on this as well as the gear inside. You insert it in. There's two plates here with a metric Allen head. It's pretty self-explanatory how to align it, tighten it up, and then just snug this nut up and you're good there. The next step will be to install the rubber end caps. There's 4 of them, one here, we're on the right side of the motor, and then 2 on the opposite side. So this is cylinder number 4, and then 2 on the outside, so on cylinder 1, the same setup. Here's the rubber plugs that came out of the end, that fit in the end that I just described to you of the valve covers. These are the original 4, and when I took them out, I keep track of which one goes where. So this is right here. You can see I just wrote on there. Let's see if I can get a shot of that. This is number 1 exhaust. That's the far left cylinder. Number 4 exhaust. So that'd be the far right of the motor. Number 1 intake. Number 4 intake. So I know which position they came out of. And I put them together like this so it's easy and straightforward. Remember, that was some time ago, many months ago, when I took this engine apart, so I just want to make sure I can keep track of everything. It always pays to take your time when taking a motor apart to label and bag and photograph everything you do. You can take it from me with a lot of experience on motors. If you don't take your time and slow down and photograph and label and bag, you will regret it, even days later, because you will not remember. And certainly weeks and months, and in some cases I've had motors that were a couple of years before I got back to them. You will be very sorry if you don't take your time and get it right. I know it's easy to get in a rush if you're enthused about taking something apart, but you need to slow down. And this is an example of how I went about labeling these simple little rubber plugs. So here's the number 1 cylinder rubber plug. It will fit in just like that. This happens to be for the intake side, which is the back end of the motor. Now frankly, I probably could have replaced all 4 of these. They're a little bit on the hard side. I've seen worse, but I've also seen better, new ones. And given the fact that these aren't really a wear item, they basically are a seal, and they sit in here like this and are trapped between the bottom curvature of the top of the motor there, and then the cover, which will fit down over the top of it. And they're just to prevent oil from leaking out on the sides. So I'm not going to be too concerned about replacing them right now. But one of the things that I will do before I put them in is I'm going to put a little bit of a gasket sealant along. I'm not going to plug this hole, but I'm going to put a little bit of a gasket sealant along here before I put them in place. The gasket sealant I'm using is Permatex High Tack. Good stuff. Not difficult to do. Take a little bit on your finger and just spread it around. I'm not too worried about a little bit of squeeze out. I'm more concerned about just good coverage. and avoid covering the hole. Then it's simply a matter of dropping it into place. Obviously you want to make sure that's clean, and put it in like that, make sure it's squared up. And again, the gasket of the cover is going to fit down over this. Like that. Times 4. So I've got the first one done, I've got to do the other 3.